think many of you know that I'm a big country music fan, but I haven't always been a big country music fan. When I was growing up in southern Ohio, we thought country music was only for the people who lived in Kentucky, and we didn't think particularly highly of the folks who lived in Kentucky. But someday I got over myself and my background, and I became a country music fan, and it actually happened in the middle of the night one time. I was sleeping and I woke up and I had forgotten to turn off my radio, and all of a sudden Willie Nelson came on singing, "Blue skies shining on me, nothing but blue skies do I see." Oh, and even when I was sleeping half awake, I thought, oh, that's good. It's so authentic, so real. And so I've been a Willie Nelson fan ever since. Particularly, I love his song, "On the Road Again." I just can't wait to be on the road again. Oh, one of my favorite songs. It was this song, "On the Road Again," that I thought about when I was looking at our gospel reading for today, because the disciples and Jesus are once again on the road again. And in Mark, in our version of it anyway, we're told that they are on the way. On the way. And that's a loaded line, folks. On the way is a loaded line for the Gospel of Mark. It's not simply about literal traveling. It's about what the disciples are up to in their lives. Perhaps you know this, but the early church was not called the church. It was called the people of the way. For them, the church wasn't a building or an institution. The church was a movement. The early church was going with Jesus as he was taking them to all kinds of new places. They were on the way, on the road with Jesus. And on the way with Jesus, the disciples in today's reading have to face some facts. And the facts are, what Jesus is teaching the disciples is that he must die. The text says the Son of Man, or literally in the Greek it says the Son of a human being is to be betrayed or handed over to human beings. One, just like everybody else, will suffer at the hands of everybody else. It's not a good commentary on the human situation. We often don't treat each other well. We often betray one another. We, as sons and daughters of human beings, often betray other human beings. And this is some of the data that we have to know as we go with Jesus. Actually, in Mark today, this is the second time that Jesus has told his disciples that he must die. We heard it last week. Perhaps you remember that. He said he had to die. And frankly, he's going to tell them one more time, he must die. We human beings, we're slow to learn. Slow to learn. Sometimes you have to be told 3 times before you get it. And in today, we're told that disciples did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him. Sometimes the facts are not what we want to hear. I remember when my grandfather died, and one of my aunts was deeply disturbed by the pain and the tears that a neighbor girl to my grandfather, a neighbor girl who had a lot of cognitive dysfunction, that she was demonstrating. And so my aunt ran to the girl and said to her, "He's not dead. He's just resting." Well, Aunt Frida, who, by the way, just died this last year, he's dead. He was dead. He's not going to get any more dead. Death is hard to talk about. It's a conversation stopper. It's so hard to talk about that sometimes it stuns our brains so that indeed, like the disciples, we don't even seem to understand the conversation. But when you're on the road with Jesus, when you're on the way with Jesus, you talk about death. You don't run from the hard stuff. Jesus won't let you, because life lived with depth, which is what I think being on the way with Jesus is all about, is life that embraces the hard stuff. When you are on the road with Jesus, you're probably going to talk about things, deal with things that people generally don't want to talk about or deal with. Yeah, you're going to confront Jesus' mortality. He must die. And you're also going to confront your own. And yes, you're also going to be confronted by your shortcomings, as well as the shortcomings of others. And yes, you will be taken to a deeper place in life where you will become dissatisfied with living life on the surface, living life as the world lives it, pursuing what the James calls wisdom that is earthly and unspiritual. On the way with Jesus, we confront the fact sometimes we'd rather not confront. We are unsettled. But we don't want to be unsettled. I understand it. I don't like to be unsettled because, frankly, we sometimes like to live life on the basis, to use computer language, of our default settings. We go to where we always go. Notice what the disciples do as they are on the way with Jesus today, or notice what Jesus notices. He detects their arguing with one another and asks, well, what were you arguing about on the way? And I give the disciples credit here. They're bold enough to tell the truth. Well, I kind of picture it going like this. Well, we were arguing about who is the greatest. While on the way with Jesus, you know what they're talking about? Themselves. The default conversation piece for us human beings is too often us. Us versus them. I versus you. How do I measure up against you? Who has more prestige or money? Who is more religious or faithful? Who wins more often? Our conversations often are filled with attempts to keep score. Now, the bold and the confident are often overt in their scorekeeping. Perhaps you'll remember, I am the greatest, Muhammad Ali said. But don't think for one moment that the timid or the insecure aren't engaging in their scorekeeping as well. Underneath it all, they often believe that everybody else is winning. They're just the losers. They may act different, but it's the same game, the same worry. Who is the greatest? Well, Jesus responds to the game by being a teacher, you teachers will appreciate this, who uses what we used to call show and tell. Okay, disciples, since you're all worrying about who's the greatest, I'll show you who the greatest is. Then he took a little child and put that little child among them, holding the child in his arms. Here's greatness. Here is who is important along the way. Now, as you hear Jesus' words, you probably don't need to get romantic about their view of children, because children in Jesus' day were not viewed as they are today. Listen to these somewhat funny but tragic words from Nadia Bolz-Weber about the children of Jesus' day. They didn't exactly take bubble baths every night before being tucked into their Sesame Street bed sheets and read Goodnight Moon. There was no sentimentality about childhood, because actually childhood was a time of terror. Children in those days only really had value as replacement adults. But until they became adults, they were more like mongrel dogs than they were beloved members of a family. And they weren't even really housebroken. They just kind of leaked everywhere, and they died like all the time. Children in those days often were dirty and useless. Children in Jesus' day were people without legal rights or power. They were the vulnerable of the vulnerable. When Jesus takes the child into his arms, he's taking vulnerability in his arms. He's telling his disciples that in his world, the first three Gospels call this world the kingdom of God, the folks on the bottom of the heap, the folks who are often forgotten, the folks whom the world might consider the losers, the folks who are vulnerable are the greatest. It's a different world with Jesus. And that is precisely the point. When you are on the way with Jesus, you're going to be taken to a world that doesn't look like the world that you and I live in. When you're on the road with Jesus, you're going to discover greatness not where the world discovers it, money, fame, prestige, popularity. You're going to discover it in some unlikely places and among some unlikely people. When you are on the way with Jesus, the scorekeeping comes to an end. The game playing that we engage in, either by trying to boast about our exploits or wallow in how we don't measure up, comes to an end. It's a whole new world with Jesus. And Jesus makes that perfectly clear as he holds that child and says some remarkable words. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes not only me, but the one who sent me, God. To welcome the vulnerable, the forgotten, is to welcome God. Wow. That indeed is an upside-down world. To welcome a vulnerable one is to welcome God. Seldom do we think of God as vulnerable. For most of us, when we think of God, we think of power, ultimate power. Could it be, and I want you to reflect on this week, could it be that what we mean by God is not simply power? Could it be that what we mean by God includes vulnerability? For me, at the heart and soul of what we experience in the cross of Jesus, especially as we see that in the Gospel of Mark, we see one who's vulnerable. We see a God who is vulnerable. In Mark, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In the cross, Jesus endures the worst pain experienced by humanity. In the cross, Jesus suffers as vulnerable human beings like us suffer. And if we think that the life and death of Jesus reveal to us the heart of God, and that is the Christian claim, then we must believe that not only is God powerful, God is remarkably vulnerable. Many folks claim that how we view God determines how we view ourselves and other people. If God is vulnerable, then it must be okay for us to be as well. Vulnerability is not something to be hated, to be spurned. It is not something to run from, something to be avoided at all possible costs. Now, don't get me wrong. Strength is not a bad thing. I happen to be a strong person, and I won't apologize for that. Accomplishment is not a bad thing. Being independent and trying to do things on your own, like my mother and like many of you have tried to do for much of your life, they are not bad things. We all know folks who wallow in their helplessness, constantly playing the victim card. But as our theme for today suggests, there is something about vulnerability, something that is good and holy, something good and holy about admitting your faults, something good and holy about admitting that you need other people, something good and holy about knowing that you have been scarred by life as has everybody else, something good and holy about realizing you've got a whole lot to learn. On the way with Jesus, we meet the vulnerability of God and our own. Life's transformed. The games are over. And while we may have to swallow our pride a bit, life becomes much deeper, much more of an experience of communion with others, and ultimately with God. On the road again. I just can't wait to get on the road again. The life I love is making music with my friends, and I can't wait to get on the road again. Jesus, 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 take us on the road again with you every day. Keep teaching us, Jesus. Keep teaching us. We know you aren't finished with us yet. Oh, vulnerable one, go ahead and make us vulnerable too. Amen.